In the rarefied air of Manhattan's elite, where dynasties were forged in steel and glass, and human connection was a commodity traded on the stock exchange of convenience, Elias Vance existed as a king in a silent, gilded prison. His empire, Vance Holdings, was a colossus that reshaped skylines, but the skyline of his own heart was shrouded in a perpetual fog of grief. What happens when a man who commands legions of attorneys and architects, a man for whom the world bends, discovers that the key to his non-verbal son's locked world isn't held by a high-priced specialist, but by a waitress struggling to pay her tuition? This is more than a story of an unlikely bond. It is a slow-burning fuse leading to an explosion of long-buried secrets, a devastating betrayal, and a shocking revelation that will either forge a new legacy from the ashes of the old or consume them all in its fire. Stay tuned to see how a simple napkin sketch could bring a billion-dollar empire to its knees. The hushed reverence of aura was a sound Elias Vance had designed himself. Perched 70 floors above the city in the tower that bore his late wife's architectural signature, the restaurant was a symphony of muted tones, polished marble, and panoramic views that made gods of its patrons. For Elias, it was the loneliest place on earth. It was Helena's masterpiece, and every perfectly angled beam, every pane of glass that captured the setting sun, was a fresh stab of memory. Across the table, his 10-year-old son, Julian, was oblivious to the splendor. They called it profound apraxia of speech, a cruel neurological trick where the brain knew the words but the mouth could not form them. Julian, Jules to the very few who were permitted that intimacy, lived in a world of profound, frustrating silence. His communication was his art. On a stack of crisp linen napkins, he drew. Not the crude stick figures of a child, but impossibly detailed architectural renderings drawn with a stolen pen from his father's briefcase. Lines were sharp, perspectives flawless. He was currently sketching the intricate suspension system of the bridge, visible in the distance, his small brow furrowed in concentration. "Julian, the chef has prepared the sea bass you liked last time," Elias said, his voice the low baritone that could quell a boardroom mutiny. It had no effect here. Jules didn't look up. His small, ink-stained fingers moved with a furious precision that was both breathtaking and heartbreaking. It was Helena's talent, a ghost animating her son's hands, and it was a talent Elias couldn't bear to look at for too long. A sigh, sharp and laced with a weariness that went bone deep, escaped Elias's lips. It had been 3 years since Helena's car had met a patch of black ice on a winding country road. 3 years of this echoing silence, punctuated only by the scratch of a pen on paper. He had deployed his fortune like an army, the finest neurologists, the most sought-after speech therapists, a full-time developmental aide with credentials that spanned 2 pages. They had all failed. They had studied Jules, catalogued his behaviors, and written lengthy reports, but none of them had ever truly seen him. He was about to make another futile attempt to get his son to eat when a young woman approached their table, her movements fluid and unobtrusive. "Excuse me, Mr. Vance. I noticed your son's drawing. May I?" Elias looked up, his default expression of mild annoyance firmly in place. She was a waitress, young, maybe 20 or 21. Her name tag, pinned to a simple black uniform, read Clara. She had intelligent, deep-set brown eyes and an air of quiet composure that was unusual in someone her age. She wasn't looking at him with the fawning deference he usually received, nor was she staring at Jules with the clinical pity he despised. Her gaze was fixed, with genuine fascination, on the napkin. "It's just a drawing," Elias clipped, his tone a clear dismissal. He wanted her to refill their water glasses and disappear. But Clara didn't move. Her eyes scanned the sketch, a small, appreciative smile touching her lips. "It's more than that," she said, her voice soft but confident. "His understanding of tensile strength is remarkable. See how he's drawn the parabolic curve of the main cables? He's not just copying what he sees. He's showing how the load is distributed to the anchorages. He's thinking like an engineer." Elias froze. Tensile strength. Parabolic curve. These weren't the words of a waitress. They were the words Helena used to use, words that had once filled this very building during its construction. Jules's pen stilled. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes, a startling, piercing grey, another inheritance from his mother, fixing on Clara. It was a seismic event. For the first time all evening, Jules had voluntarily disengaged from his private world to acknowledge another human being. Clara, sensing the shift, knelt down slightly, bringing herself closer to his eye level. She didn't speak to him in the saccharine, high-pitched tone most adults used. She spoke to him as an equal. "You've exaggerated the height of the towers just a little," she said, pointing a slender finger at the drawing. "It gives it a more dramatic sense of scale, a bit of architectural license. I like it. Have you ever considered adding a truss system to support the deck?" The impossible happened. Jules picked up another napkin, and with a few swift, certain strokes, he sketched a Pratt truss beneath the bridge's roadway, perfectly integrated into his original design. He then slid the napkin across the table towards her. A conversation, silent but profound, had just taken place. Elias Vance, a man who could bend global markets to his will, who could raise and raise corporate empires with a single phone call, was rendered utterly, profoundly speechless. His heart, a fortress encased in 3 years of calcified grief, felt a tectonic shift. A hairline crack had just appeared in the foundation. Clara's warm brown eyes met Elias's over Jules's head. There was no hint of pride in her expression, only a shared awe. "He has a gift," she whispered, as if stating a sacred, undeniable truth. In that moment, Elias didn't see a waitress earning tips. He saw a Rosetta Stone. He saw the first glimmer of light in the suffocating darkness of his son's silence. He saw someone who, in less than a minute, had breached the walls of a fortress he had been besieging for years. The fortress around Elias's own heart did not fall that day, but a single tenacious seed of hope had been planted in the crack, and he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he had to see this woman again. It wasn't about feelings, he rationalized, his mind retreating to the familiar comfort of strategy. It was about solving a problem. Jules was a problem, and this woman, this Clara, she might be the key, an asset to be acquired. He was wrong. He was catastrophically, magnificently wrong. But he wouldn't understand the depth of his miscalculation until much later. For now, he just watched, his meticulously ordered world tilting on its axis, as a waitress and his silent son continued to build their silent bridge of ink and understanding. The next day, Elias Vance did something that sent ripples of panic through his executive floor. He cancelled his entire afternoon. A hostile takeover bid for a German pharmaceutical company was paused mid-strike. A call with the Secretary of Commerce was postponed. His reason, given to his bewildered executive assistant, was simply a personal asset acquisition. He was back at Aura, at the same corner table that felt like his personal purgatory. He had, of course, called the restaurant manager and requested Clara specifically, a demand met with the kind of swift, unquestioning obedience his name always commanded. Jules sat beside him, a fresh stack of napkins and a set of professional-grade drafting pens, purchased that morning, laid out before him. The boy was already lost in his work, this time sketching the restaurant's interior, capturing the complex geometry of the ceiling's support beams. When Clara arrived, she offered a small, professional smile. There was a wariness in her eyes he hadn't seen the day before. She was on her guard. "Welcome back, Mr. Vance. Julian," she said, her voice even. She'd remembered his son's name. "Can I get you something to drink?" "He's been calmer since yesterday," Elias admitted, the words feeling awkward and foreign. He wasn't a man who confessed to emotional states, his own or his son's. "It's good to have your work seen," Clara said simply, placing a glass of apple juice in front of Jules without being asked. She turned her attention to Elias. "The usual for you, Mr. Vance? Black coffee. And you'll pretend to read the menu for 10 minutes before ordering the seared tuna, no sauce." Elias was genuinely taken aback. He was a creature of rigid habit, a trait he leveraged to his advantage in negotiations. But for this young woman to have catalogued his behavior so precisely from a handful of observations was both unsettling and deeply impressive. "You're observant," he stated. It was a compliment of the highest order coming from him. "It's part of the job," she replied with a non-committal shrug. "But I also think it's important to actually look at people, not just glance at them. You can learn a lot by paying attention." Her gaze flickered meaningfully toward Jules. The subtext was clear. "You haven't been paying attention." Throughout the meal, a silent ritual unfolded. Clara would serve them, and in the brief moments she was at their table, she would comment on Jules's drawing. "That's a clever use of cross-hatching to show the texture of the marble," she'd say. Or, "You have a real eye for negative space." And each time, Jules would reward her with a new detail, a fresh sketch, a flicker of a smile that was so rare it felt like a miracle. Elias found himself watching her, studying her. He noticed the slight fraying on the cuff of her uniform, the subtle weariness in her posture that spoke of long hours on her feet. This was not her world, yet she moved through it with a quiet dignity that was more commanding than his own power. "Why do you know so much about architecture?" he finally asked, abandoning all pretense. Clara hesitated, a flicker of something, pride, sadness, crossing her face. "I was a student at Cooper Union. Second year, architecture program." "Was? My mother got sick last year. Pancreatic cancer. The treatments, well, they're not cheap. I had to take a leave of absence. The job here has good hours." She delivered the information factually, without a trace of self-pity. The story was a stark, brutal summary of a dream deferred. It explained everything: her knowledge, her maturity, her need for this job. The revelation created a fragile bridge between their two vastly different worlds. He, who could buy a hospital if he chose, and she, who had sacrificed her future to afford one. For the first time, he felt a stirring of something beyond a strategic interest in her. It was a nascent, uncomfortable flicker of empathy. He cleared his throat, retreating to the safety of commerce. "I have a proposal for you." Clara's eyebrows rose slightly. "A proposal?" "I want to hire you, to be a companion for Jules, a tutor. I don't care what you call it. I'll pay you 10 times your current salary." The offer was blunt, a transaction. He was on familiar ground now. Clara's warm expression turned to ice. "Mr. Vance, my time with your son isn't a service for sale." "I'm not trying to buy your time," he said, frustrated by his own lack of finesse. "I'm trying to help my son. 20 times your salary. Name a figure." She shook her head, and the look in her eyes was one of profound disappointment. "You still don't see it, do you? This isn't about money. Jules and I connect because I see the world the way he does. I speak his language. You can't write a check for authenticity." She turned to walk away, and a jolt of pure, unadulterated panic shot through Elias. He couldn't let her go. She was the only lead he'd had in 3 years. "Wait," he called out, his voice sharper, more desperate than he'd intended. Clara paused, her back to him. "Please," he said. The word felt like swallowing gravel. He hadn't pleaded for anything in his adult life. "Don't think of it as a job. Think of it as a fellowship, a private study. You can work with him here, a few hours each day. You can use him as a case study. I'll fund your mother's medical care, all of it. And when you're ready to go back to school, your tuition will be paid, in full." He had, for the first time, offered something other than just money. He had offered her back her dream. He had spoken to her needs, not just his own. Clara turned slowly, her brown eyes searching his face. She saw past the billionaire titan. She saw the lost, desperate father. "I'll consider it," she said softly, "under 2 conditions." "Anything," he said, the relief in his voice palpable. "First, you are present for every session. No phone calls, no emails. You sit here and you learn to speak his language with me. Second," she hesitated, taking a deep breath, "you tell me about his mother. You tell me about Helena." The request was a punch to the gut. Helena was a locked room in his memory, a shrine he never visited. But he looked at his son, who had just sketched a perfect, smiling portrait of Clara on a napkin, and he knew he had no choice. "Done," he said, the word a surrender and a promise. As Clara walked away, Elias looked at the portrait his son had drawn. It was the first time Jules had drawn a human face since the accident. He realized then that Clara's conditions were not for her benefit, but for his. She wasn't just offering to help his son. She was offering to help him. The path forward was unmapped territory. This strange arrangement was built on a foundation of napkins and grief, a negotiation with no contracts, only conditions of the heart. But as Elias felt the first thaw in his emotional permafrost, he was unaware of the shadow watching from the corner of the restaurant. Richard Sterling, his brother-in-law, Helena's brother, a man whose smile was as polished and treacherous as black ice, and whose ambition was a cold, patient serpent, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The sessions at Aura became the new, strange anchor of Elias's week. He was a man whose life was dictated by the merciless logic of the market, but for 2 hours, 3 times a week, he surrendered to a different kind of timetable, one measured in the slow, deliberate strokes of his son's pen. The first few meetings were an exercise in excruciating restraint. His phone, placed face down on the table as per Clara's rule, felt like a live grenade. The phantom buzz of a non-existent call made the muscles in his jaw clench, but he held to his word. He sat. He watched. And slowly, he began to see. He saw the way Clara never crowded Jules, giving him the physical and emotional space he needed. She would bring books, heavy tomes on structural engineering and architectural history, and leave them open on the table. She never pushed. She simply made the information available, an invitation Jules would eventually, cautiously, accept. He would study the pages for long minutes, then incorporate new ideas, a flying buttress, a geodesic dome, into his own fantastical creations. Clara, in turn, was conducting her own quiet reconnaissance. She was watching Elias, gauging his sincerity, testing the cracks in his formidable armor. One afternoon, as Jules was meticulously drawing a city of impossible, spiraling towers, she turned to Elias, her expression unreadable. You said you'd tell me about her." The question hung in the air, as fragile and clear as the crystal glasses on the table. Elias flinched, his defenses rising like a shield wall. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice tight. "I want to know why looking at your son's drawings causes you so much pain," she said, her directness a surgical strike. "He has her gift, doesn't he? It should be a comfort, a connection. But for you, it's a ghost." "You have no right," he began, his voice cold with fury. "I have every right," she countered, her own voice rising with a passion that startled him. "Your pain is a wall between you and your son. He feels it. He may not have the words, but he feels you pull away every time he picks up a pen. You are punishing him for reminding you of her." Her words were the unvarnished, brutal truth, and they hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had been so consumed by his own grief that he hadn't realized he was treating Helena's legacy in his son as a wound, a curse. He looked at Jules, whose pen had stopped, his small shoulders slumped. He was listening. He understood. A wave of shame, hot and suffocating, washed over Elias. He had failed them both. He had honored Helena's memory by encasing himself in ice when she had been all warmth and fire. He finally looked at Clara, his eyes stripped bare of their usual authority, revealing the raw, aching grief beneath. "Her hands," he began, his voice thick, ragged. She had the most expressive hands. When she was excited about a design, she would talk with them, sketching ideas in the air. "Jules, he has her hands." He swallowed hard, the admission a shard of glass in his throat. "When he draws, I see her, and it's like losing her all over again, every single day." It was the first time he had spoken of his pain to another living soul. The confession didn't heal him, but it lanced the wound, letting out some of the poison that had been festering for 3 years. Clara didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. She just nodded, her eyes filled with a deep, knowing empathy that was more comforting than any words could be. From that day on, something shifted. Elias started to participate. He would ask Jules questions about his drawings, questions prompted by Clara. "Why did you use that archway, Jules? What is this building for?" Jules would respond with more drawings, creating narratives in intricate, silent panels. A library for lonely people, a hospital with gardens on every floor, a home for them, with a big sunlit studio for him to work in, right next to his father's office. Elias began to see not just his wife's ghost, but his son's soul. He was falling in love with Jules all over again, not as a broken piece of his past, but as the brilliant, resilient architect of his own future. And with that love came a terrifying, exhilarating new emotion. He was falling for Clara. He was drawn to her fierce intelligence, her stubborn compassion, her unwavering belief in his son when he himself had faltered. Their fragile, burgeoning world, however, was being observed. Richard Sterling had been watching from the sidelines, his concern curdling into a venomous resentment. Richard, who had been appointed to the board of Vance Holdings after his sister's death, saw himself as the true guardian of Helena's legacy. He had always been eclipsed by his brilliant sister, and now he saw this waitress, this interloper, not only getting close to Elias's fortune, but, more unforgivably, nurturing the very talent in Jules that Richard secretly coveted and lacked. He decided it was time to intervene. He launched a discreet but thorough investigation into Clara's life. He learned about her mother's mounting medical bills, the second mortgage on her parents' home, the crushing weight of their debt. He saw not a family struggling, but a set of levers to be pulled. He found his weapon. One evening, as Clara was leaving her apartment for her night shift at a second, less glamorous waitressing job she had kept. A gleaming black sedan slid to the curb beside her. The tinted window descended, revealing Richard Sterling's handsome, predatory face. "Clara," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured purr. "I'm Richard Sterling, Helena's brother. I think you and I should have a conversation." A knot of dread tightened in Clara's stomach. She had met him once, briefly at the restaurant. His eyes, unlike Helena's or Jules's, were cold and empty. "I don't think we have anything to talk about," she said, her hand tightening on her bag. "Oh, but we do," Richard said, his smile never touching his eyes. "We need to talk about my nephew, and about a very generous fellowship I've arranged for you at the Royal Institute of British Architects. A full ride, all expenses paid. All you have to do is get on a plane and disappear from my family's life." He let the offer hang in the air, a dazzling, poisoned fruit. "Get in the car, Clara. Let's discuss the terms of your surrender." The door clicked open, an invitation into a world of gilded traps and elegant threats, a world that could give her everything she had ever dreamed of, but would cost her the one thing she was beginning to realize she couldn't live without. With a heart full of foreboding, knowing she had no real choice but to hear him out, Clara slid into the cold leather seat. The game had just escalated, and she was no longer just an observer. She was the primary target. The interior of the sedan was like a sensory deprivation chamber, insulating Clara from the vibrant, chaotic pulse of the city she loved. It smelled of expensive leather and quiet menace. Richard Sterling sat opposite her, a portrait of relaxed power, a stark contrast to the frantic hammering of her own heart. "What do you want, Mr. Sterling?" Clara asked, her voice quiet but firm. He gestured to a chilled bottle of water in a recessed holder. She shook her head. He ignored it, continuing as if she hadn't spoken. "Let's be direct, Clara. You're a bright girl. You're an architecture student, or you were. You understand that every structure has a weak point. In the otherwise formidable structure of my brother-in-law's life, you have become that point. I'm helping your nephew." "You're giving him false hope," Richard countered, his voice losing its silken edge and taking on a sharper, crueler tone. "My sister was a once-in-a-generation genius. Julian," he doodles, "your encouragement is a kindness that will ultimately lead to a greater pain when he realizes he can never measure up to her. You are setting him up for a lifetime of failure and disappointment." The accusation was so monstrous, so deliberately twisted, that it left Clara momentarily breathless. He wasn't just trying to get rid of her. He was trying to invalidate the very core of Jules's being. "You're wrong," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "He's not just doodling. He's brilliant. His mind is extraordinary." Richard laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Ah, yes, the brilliance. Elias is blinded by grief. He sees Helena in the boy, and now, I suspect, he sees some sort of salvation in you. It's a dangerous cocktail of sentimentality, and I am here to protect my family, my sister's legacy, and the stability of a billion-dollar enterprise from it." He leaned forward, his cologne cloying and invasive. "I don't like complications. You are a complication. I'm a person who cares about a little boy, and I admire that," he said, with infuriating condescension. "Which is why I am offering you an elegant solution." He slid a thick, embossed envelope across the polished console. "As I mentioned, a full scholarship to study in London, a generous stipend, an internship with a top firm upon graduation. Your mother's medical bills will be handled anonymously. Your parents' mortgage will be paid off." Clara stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. It was her every dream, every prayer, packaged as a bribe. It was a golden key to a future she thought she had lost forever. And in return, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You vanish," he said bluntly. "You write a polite, firm note to Elias, explaining that the pressure is too much, that you need to focus on your own life. You will not answer his calls. You will not see Julian again. You will become a ghost, a pleasant but distant memory. And if I say no?" The smile vanished from Richard's face, replaced by a look of glacial coldness. "Then things get complicated. For you, for your family. A mother's health insurance can be inexplicably cancelled due to clerical errors. A father's job can be made redundant. A promising student's reputation can be tarnished by whispers of instability, of unprofessional conduct. I am on the board of dozens of charities and cultural institutions, Clara. My reach is long. I can make it so that you will never work in architecture or any related field in this country again. You will spend the rest of your life serving coffee and wondering what might have been." The threat was not just a threat. It was a detailed blueprint for her destruction. He would systematically dismantle her life, her family's life, with the casual indifference of a developer tearing down an old building. Tears of helpless rage pricked at her eyes. She thought of her mother's tired face, her father's quiet dignity in the face of financial strain. He was using her love for them as a weapon against her. "You're a monster," she whispered. "I'm a pragmatist," he corrected her smoothly. "I am protecting my sister's legacy from a nobody, a waitress who got lucky. So, what will it be? Your dream, your family's security, or a little boy's doodles?" The car glided to a stop a block from her apartment. The journey had taken less than 20 minutes, but her entire world had been irrevocably altered. "You have until Friday," Richard said, his voice once again calm and controlled. "A courier will deliver the flight tickets and the initial paperwork. If you don't sign, I will assume you have chosen the more complicated path. I sincerely hope, for everyone's sake, that you are as smart as you seem." Clara stumbled out of the car, the heavy envelope clutched in her hand. She stood on the pavement, watching the black sedan disappear, a shark gliding back into the deep. She felt trapped in an impossible choice: sacrifice her own soul, or watch her family be destroyed. The next day's session with Elias and Jules was torture. She tried to smile, to engage, to be the same calm, reassuring presence for Jules, but her heart felt like a lead weight in her chest. Elias, ever more attuned to her since their conversation, noticed immediately. "Clara, is everything all right?" he asked, his grey eyes searching hers with a concern that made her guilt twist like a knife. "You seem a million miles away." "Just a long night," she lied, the words tasting like ash. She couldn't meet his gaze. Instead, she looked at Jules. He was watching her, his own expression one of intense, worried concentration. He had stopped drawing his fantastical city. Instead, he was sketching her face. But in his drawing, she was crying. He saw it. He saw right through her carefully constructed facade. He slid the drawing towards her, then reached out his small hand and rested it on her arm. It was the first time he had ever initiated physical contact with her. It was an act of pure, simple comfort, and it shattered her. She mumbled an excuse and fled to the restroom, locking herself in a stall as silent sobs racked her body. How could she abandon this child, this incredible empathetic boy who could see her pain when no one else could? That night, she sat in her small apartment, the envelope from Richard on her table, a ticking bomb. It contained her future. It also contained her damnation. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Elias. Jules just drew a new building for his city. It's called Clara's School of Design. Thank you. For everything." The words were a final, devastating blow. She was becoming a part of their world, a part of their healing. Richard's timing had been perfect. He had waited until the roots of her connection were deep enough that tearing them out would cause the maximum possible damage. She looked at the envelope. Richard Sterling had made one critical, arrogant mistake. He assumed her ambition and her love for her family were weaknesses he could exploit. He didn't understand that they were also the source of her greatest strength. And it was that strength, that fierce, protective love, that clarified her next move. She picked up her phone, but she didn't text Elias. Not yet. He was still too close to Richard, still bound by the ghost of Helena. He might not believe her. He might think she was trying to manipulate him. She had to fight this battle herself, on her own terms. She sent a text to the one person she knew she could trust. A friend from her university days, a tech prodigy who now worked in cybersecurity. "Hey Ben, I have a strange and possibly crazy favor to ask. It involves a very powerful man and a potential data trail. Are you free to talk?" A reply came back almost instantly. "For you, Clara, always. Let's burn something down." She took a deep breath. Richard Sterling wanted her to disappear. He thought he could buy her silence and erase her from the board. He had severely underestimated her. He had started a war, and she had just recruited her first soldier. The elevator ride to Aura felt like an ascent to the gallows. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the serene hum of the machinery. In her purse, she carried a small, powerful digital audio recorder, a loan from her friend Ben. Her plan was audacious, reckless, and entirely dependent on Richard Sterling's unshakable arrogance. She had agreed to meet him for a final conversation before the Friday deadline, choosing the restaurant as the location. A neutral ground where he might feel secure, yet a place so deeply symbolic for her and Elias. It was a gamble, a desperate, last-ditch effort to get proof of his threats. Richard was already at a secluded table, a glass of scotch in his hand, the very picture of corporate predation. He smiled as she approached, a cold, triumphant gleam in his eyes. "Clara, I'm so glad you decided to be sensible," he began, gesturing for her to sit. "I trust you have the signed paperwork." "I have questions," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She subtly activated the recorder in her purse. "Oh?" His smile tightened. "I thought my offer was quite clear." "It was," she agreed. "But I want to understand why. Why go to such lengths? If you're so concerned about Jules, why not help him? Why not find him the best tutors, celebrate his talent?" Richard leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He was confident, enjoying his victory. "Because his talent is a pale imitation, a cheap copy. My sister Helena was a visionary. She built this tower." He swept his hand in a gesture that encompassed the entire restaurant, the entire city beyond the glass. She created a legacy of strength, of perfection. Julian is a fragile, silent echo. To hold his art up to her standard would be an insult to her memory. I am merely protecting her from that. "Protecting her? Or protecting yourself?" Clara pressed, her voice gaining an edge. "You were always in her shadow, weren't you? And now you see her genius reborn in her son, and you can't stand it. You're not trying to protect Helena's legacy. You're trying to erase it so you can build your own on top of it." The direct hit wiped the smile from his face. His eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. "You are an incredibly presumptuous little girl," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Don't I? Clara pushed on, her fear being burned away by a clarifying rage. I've seen Helena's early work. The university archives are public. Her initial concepts were wild, fantastical, just like Jules's. She took risks. She wasn't afraid to fail. You're the one who's afraid. You're terrified that this silent little boy is more of an architect than you will ever be. That's enough, Richard snarled, his composure cracking completely. He leaned across the table, his voice a venomous hiss. You were given a golden ticket out of your miserable life, and you're throwing it back in my face. Fine. Have it your way. I'll call my contact at the insurance company this afternoon. Let's see how your mother's pre-authorization for her next round of chemo holds up under review. I'll have my lawyers look at your parents' mortgage. I'm sure we can find a covenant they've breached. And as for you, by the time I'm done, your name will be a synonym for unemployable. It was everything she needed. A full confession, laced with specific, actionable threats. She clutched her purse, her knuckles white. It's done then, she said, her voice hollow, playing the part of the defeated. Yes, it is, he said, settling back in his chair, a cruel smirk returning to his face. A shame. You could have had the world. At that moment, a shadow fell. The shadow that fell across their table was not merely an absence of light, but a sudden, chilling drop in the room's ambient temperature. It was the arrival of a gravity well, a presence that bent the world around it. She already does. Elias Vance's voice was not loud, but it cut through the restaurant's hushed reverence like a shard of falling ice. It was a sound Clara had never heard from him before, stripped of boardroom authority, devoid of paternal weariness. It was the sound of a glacier carving, of a tectonic plate shifting after centuries of pressure. Richard Sterling's head snapped up, his handsome face, moments before a mask of smug victory, contorting into a rictus of disbelief. Beside Elias, holding his father's hand, not in a gesture of childish need, but of mutual anchorage, stood Jules. The boy's eyes, those startlingly perceptive grey mirrors of his mother's, were fixed on his uncle. There was no fear in them now, only a profound, silent judgment. Ilias's gaze, however, was locked on Clara. In its depths, she saw the storm she had only glimpsed before, the howling fury at Richard's betrayal, the crushing weight of his own blindness, and beneath it all, a current of fierce, unyielding pride in her that felt like a physical force, steadying her in her seat. Elias, Richard stammered, his face a blotchy canvas of panic. The colour had fled, leaving behind a sickly, pale sheen. What a surprise. I thought you were in the final round with the Frankfurt acquisition. Priorities change, Elias said, his voice lethally calm. He slid a slim, obsidian-black tablet onto the table between them. Its screen glowed, displaying not a stock ticker or an email, but a real-time audio waveform that pulsed with the ghost of Richard's recent threats. Clara's friend, Ben, a remarkable cybersecurity analyst. He believes in loyalty. It's a concept you might want to look up. He patched me into this negotiation the moment it began. Richard's eyes darted from the tablet to Clara, his expression curdling into one of pure, venomous hatred. The predator, caught in the snare. She's a viper, Elias, a conniving, social-climbing schemer who's been playing you from the start. She's turning you against me, against family. Family? Elias's laugh was a harsh, bitter sound that held no humour. You dare speak that word to me? The only poison here, Richard, is the rot of your own envy. It's been eating you alive for decades. You envied Helena her talent, her fire. You couldn't stand being the lesser star in her orbit. And now you see that same fire, that same impossible gift in her son, and you're trying to smother it before it can outshine you too." He gestured to Jules, who had remained preternaturally still throughout the exchange. "For 3 years, I tried to force him to speak. I brought in experts, specialists, an army of people who tried to fix him. I was a fool. I was trying to fix the wrong thing. He has been speaking all along, in a language of lines and perspective, of beauty and structure. A language you are too tone-deaf to ever understand." Elias reached into his breast pocket, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. He withdrew a folded linen napkin and placed it on the table, smoothing it out with a hand that trembled slightly. It was Jules's drawing of the concert hall, the impossible, breathtakingly beautiful structure of swirling glass and light. "You called this a doodle," Elias said, his voice dropping to an almost inaudible whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "A cheap copy, an insult to her memory." He paused, letting the weight of Richard's own words suffocate him. Helena was drafting this exact concept in the months before she died. It was her secret passion project, her cathedral of sound. She kept the notebooks locked away, never showed them to anyone, not even me. She said she was protecting it from the pragmatists, from the committees. She was waiting for it to be perfect. He leaned forward, his entire being focused into a single point of burning intensity aimed directly at Richard's soul. "So you tell me, Richard, explain to me how my son, who has never laid eyes on those notebooks, is drawing his mother's secret masterpiece. How is that possible, unless it is not a memory, but an inheritance, a direct, cellular transmission of genius, the very legacy you have dedicated yourself to extinguishing?" The accusation was a finishing blow. It was not about business or betrayal anymore. It was about sacrilege. Richard Sterling, the self-appointed guardian of Helena's legacy, stood revealed as its would-be murderer. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was undone, not by Elias's fortune, but by the undeniable truth sketched on a piece of cloth by a silent 10-year-old boy. "Security," Elias said, his voice regaining its familiar tone of command, now wielded like a judge's gavel. Two immense, impeccably suited men detached themselves from the restaurant's entrance, their presence instantly changing the dynamics of the room. "Mr. Sterling is leaving. He is no longer a member of the board of Vance Holdings. His access to all company properties, accounts, and personnel is revoked, effective immediately." As the guards took Richard's arms, his paralysis broke. He lunged, not at Elias, but towards the table, his hand grasping for the napkin. "It's a trick! A forgery!" Jules, in a movement of shocking speed and decisiveness, placed his small hand flat on the drawing, protecting it. He looked his uncle dead in the eye, and for the first time, a sound escaped his lips. It was not a word, but a low, guttural growl of pure defiance. It was the sound of a lion cub protecting its birthright. The sound broke Richard. He sagged in the guard's grip, a deflated effigy of the man he was moments before. As they steered him away, he twisted his head, his final, venomous glare reserved for Clara. "You will regret this," he spat. "No," Clara said, her voice clear and resonant in the stunned silence. "You already do." The car ride back to the penthouse was a study in silence, but it was a different silence from the one Elias had known for 3 years. The old silence had been a void, an absence of connection. This new silence was dense, heavy with the gravity of all that had just happened and all that remained unsaid. It was the charged stillness after a lightning strike, the air tasting of ozone and radical change. Elias drove, his hands gripping the leather-wrapped wheel with a force that made his knuckles white. His gaze was fixed on the river of taillights flowing down Park Avenue. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene at Aura, re-examining the past 3 years through a new, horrifyingly clear lens. He saw himself, a titan of industry, rendered helpless by grief, while a waitress, a brilliant, courageous young woman, had single-handedly diagnosed the sickness in his family and surgically removed the cancer. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, metallic taste at the back of his throat. He had offered her money, employment, a solution. She had offered his son a language and offered Elias himself a path back to the living. Clara sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The adrenaline had evaporated, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The weight of her mother's illness, her family's debt, Richard's threats. It had all been lifted in one fell swoop, and the sudden lightness was disorienting, almost painful. She looked at her reflection in the window, a pale ghost against the glittering cityscape. Who was she now? She was no longer just a student, a waitress. She was a key player in the implosion of a dynasty, the confidant of a billionaire, the protector of a gifted child. The roles felt too large, the costume ill-fitting. She stole a glance at Elias, at the rigid set of his jaw, and a new, quiet fear began to bloom in her chest. Now that the battle was won, would he still need his soldier? In the back, Jules was the calm center of their silent storm. He wasn't drawing. He was simply watching the city lights blur past, his small face serene. He had been seen. He had been heard. He had protected his work. For him, the world had finally, blessedly, clicked into focus. He reached forward, his small fingers brushing the back of his father's neck, then rested his hand lightly on Clara's shoulder. It was not a plea for attention, but a statement of fact. A connection. We are here, together. The simple touch broke the tension. Elias's shoulders slumped slightly, the rigid control giving way to a wave of emotion, so powerful it made his vision blur. He pulled the car over to the curb, engaging the hazard lights that pulsed like a frantic heartbeat in the cavernous quiet of the street. He turned, not to Clara, but to the back seat, to his son. "Jules," he began, his voice cracking. He didn't continue. He couldn't. The words of apology, of regret, of awe were a log jam in his throat. Clara watched, her own fears dissolving in the face of his raw, unguarded pain. This was not the powerful Elias Vance. This was a father who had almost failed his son, a man staring into the abyss of his own mistakes. Jules simply looked at his father, his expression patient. Then he unbuckled his seatbelt, picked up his tablet from the seat beside him, the new communication device they had just begun to explore, and with a focus that was absolute, he began to type. The clicks of the virtual keyboard were the only sounds in the car. After a long moment, he turned the screen around. 5 words glowed in the darkness. "You're listening now, Dad. It's okay." The logjam in Elias's throat broke. A single ragged sob escaped him. It was a sound of 3 years of grief, of guilt, of loneliness, finally being released. He reached back, his hand finding his son's, and held on as if he were a drowning man. Clara placed her hand over both of theirs, her touch a silent promise. They stayed like that for a long time as the city rushed on around them, a small island of stillness, forging a new family treaty in the pulsing, anonymous dark. The penthouse, once a monument to a frozen past, became a crucible for their future. The first order of business was not a legal strategy or a press release, but an act of quiet revolution. The following morning, Elias led Jewel and Clara into Helena's studio, a space he had kept sealed since her death, a perfect, dust-free shrine. He walked to the locked flat files containing her final, secret project. "The key," Richard said, "was in my office safe." "He lied," Elias said, his voice flat. He looked at Jules. "He didn't know she gave you one, did he?" Jules nodded. He walked to a heavy oak bookshelf and pressed a sequence of books. Vitruvius, Palladio, Le Corbusier. And a hidden panel slid open, revealing a small safe. He entered a code, his own birthday, and it clicked open. Inside lay a single, ornate silver key. He took it, walked to the cabinet, and unlocked it. For Elias, it was a revelation. Helena had not just passed on her talent. She had passed on the key to her legacy, entrusting it to her silent son, knowing that only a mind like his could truly understand it. Together, they pulled out the large vellum sheets. There it was, the Cathedral of Sound in Helena's bold, expressive hand. And as they laid Jules's napkin drawing beside it, the connection was undeniable. The core concept, the soaring, organic lines, the very soul of the building, it was the same. Jules had not been copying a memory. He had been continuing a conversation. "He tried to erase you," Elias whispered, his hand hovering over Helena's signature. "And in doing so, he almost made me erase our son." He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a desperate need for absolution. "How do I fix this? How do I even begin?" "You don't fix it," Clara said softly, her gaze taking in the room, the drawings, the father and son. "You build something new with the pieces." And so they began. The building was not a home, it was a project. Clara, armed with Jules's sketches and Helena's original drafts, became the lead architect. She enrolled back at Cooper Union, not as a student in need, but as a peer, bringing a real-world project to the university that would form the basis of her thesis. Elias funded it, not through Vance Holdings, but through a new entity, the Helena and Julian Vance Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to the intersection of art, architecture, and neurodiversity. Its first act was to acquire a plot of land overlooking the river. Its second was to formally commission Clara's firm, which she co-founded with two of her most talented university friends, to bring the Cathedral of Sound to life. Her family's burdens were lifted not with a single, crass check, but with the Foundation's first official grants. Her mother's medical care was overseen by a new research program for pancreatic cancer, and her father was offered a position managing the Foundation's community outreach, a job that utilized his skills and restored his dignity. Elias did not give her a handout. He built a world where her family could thrive on their own terms. The months that followed were a blur of creation. The cold, minimalist penthouse was torn apart. Walls came down, light flooded in. Jules, acting as co-designer, directed the transformation with his tablet and a blizzard of sketches, creating a home that was a living, breathing space, with a vast, sun-drenched studio at its heart, where father and son now worked side by side. The relationship between Elias and Clara evolved with the same slow, deliberate, and powerful pace as the building rising on the riverbank. There was no grand, cinematic romance. Their love was built in the shared language of blueprints and stress tests, in late nights spent poring over models, in the quiet understanding that passed between them as they watched Jules explain a complex, structural concept to a team of seasoned engineers. It was a love forged not in whispered sweet nothings, but in the mutual respect of two builders creating something meant to last. 18 months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, the three of them stood on the soaring observation deck of the nearly completed Cathedral of Sound. The setting sun ignited the city, turning the glass and steel towers into pillars of fire. The Vance Tower stood among them, but from here it no longer looked like a monument to grief. It was just one part of a larger skyline, a skyline that now included this new, impossible structure of hope. Jules was no longer silent. He spoke mostly through his tablet, his typed words eloquent and precise. But occasionally, when his passion for a design overwhelmed him, a single, hard-won spoken word would emerge, each one a testament to his resilience. He was now pointing towards the Brooklyn Bridge, explaining to Clara how its suspension system had inspired the canopy of the concert hall. Elias stood back, watching them. He watched the way the wind caught Clara's hair, the way her eyes lit up as she debated an acoustic paneling choice with Jules, the easy, brilliant rhythm of their communication. The hole in his heart, the one left by Helena, was no longer a gaping wound. It had been filled, not replaced, but healed over with something new and profoundly beautiful. He had learned that a legacy was not a static object to be guarded, but a living thing to be nurtured, to be allowed to grow and change. Clara turned and saw him watching, a question in her warm, brown eyes. He closed the distance between them, taking her hand. It felt solid, real, the hand of an architect, a partner. "I was wrong about this place," he said, his voice quiet amidst the wind. "Aura. I thought it was the loneliest place on earth." "And now?" she asked. He looked from her face to his son's, then out at the sprawling, infinite city, a city he no longer wanted to conquer, but simply to share. "Now," Elias Vance said, a genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "I know it's just a place with a good view. The world is right here." He squeezed her hand. Jules looked over, saw the gesture, and a slow, radiant smile spread across his face. He walked over and slipped his own hand between theirs, his grip firm and sure. The three of them stood together, a triangulation of strength, silhouetted against the setting sun, a family built not of blood and obligation, but of courage, trust, and a love that had finally learned to speak in every language, including silence.